Thank you very much. This is a great honor for me to be talking to my fellow compatriots in Turkey, even though I talk in English, but that is the language of science. Çok teşekkür ederim geldiğiniz için konuşmama. And I'll talk in English the rest of the time. But this invitation allowed me to sort of think of the entire sort of my professional trajectory, and I became interested in sociology in college, Boğaziçi Üniversitesi, and I remember, my at the time my professors were Şerif Mardin, Ayşe. Ayşe Öncü, and then Faruk Yüksek. Çağlar Keyder came and gave talks sometimes because he was friends with Faruk Yüksek. Yes, those were at least the main people who shaped me. And then I came, of course, and continued, and now I'm a sociologist. Go figure. What have I been focusing on in my work? I've always been interested in the pace of change in Turkey, why it changes in the directions it does, and it's because of that I have looked at Westernization first, as what were the dynamics behind that, and then of course that got me into power inequities and who was left out during the period of Westernization. And that is when I started focusing on minorities and trying to see things from the vantage point of minorities, which is what I had to do basically for the Denial of Violence book, my last solo-authored book. And that was very pivotal in, I think, establishing sort of what I'm doing and why I'm doing what I'm doing. And in this work, I sort of will take you from that work, what I learned from there, and then move on to explain how one develops a comparative agenda. And that is the case because I'm now working on a theory book, trying to develop a theory that I call triangulation theory from the vantage point of minorities, because we have understood with post-colonial theory that most of the theories we have are always naturalized and normalized in terms of presenting us the norms, values, practices of the white or let's say the majority, whoever the majority will be, as if they were the norms, values of the entire society. And we know that's not the case. What happens in that case is the vantage point and the realities, so to speak, of minorities either become ignored, marginalized, silenced, repressed. And why is this problematic? It is problematic because you can judge how good a democracy is in a society, how well it functions, not in relation to whether it serves the needs and purposes of the majority. It does, because they all reflect the interests, norms, and values of the majority anyhow, but rather how they provide space and respect the rights of minorities. And that is why people argue that the positions of minorities in a society demonstrates the degree of democracy any society can accomplish, because it is basically how those who are not a part of the system, how they thrive in that society is sort of what ought to be focused on in general. What I do now is, as I said, contemporary against minority in Turkey and the United States. Let's start off by looking at the whole sort of unit of analysis. what I did with the Denial of Violence book, the last book, is I looked at specifically collective violence against minorities. And this is because violence as the unit of analysis is significant, I think, because it has in it elements of both action and emotion at the same time. I mean, violence is important because it also brings together the two groups rather than only focusing on the perpetrators or the victims. Violence enables you to look at them together. And I think that is very important to do. As I said, it brings in emotions, and that is a major shortcoming of Western modernity in the way that it emphasizes science, the behavioral, the observable, and the measurable. It doesn't do as good a job with emotions because it is not easily observable in the same way. What emotions, of course, as we've seen more and more, is much more significant to take into account than we have in the past. The other thing about violence is that because I looked at violence over 220 years in the book, I could see the differences of violence in the practices of violence over time, which is also important because violence is a process. And in order to understand the value, the meaning that it gets, you have to contextualize it, immerse it in time, in space, with respect to the meanings, attributed to it to get a better sense of what it looks like. And also violence, you can see when you look at it over time, is that it becomes layered. The repertoires of violence sort of grow in a society, depending on, how things transform over time. And violence begets violence, unfortunately. That's the important part. And one thing that I also found is that accountability is crucial. Because lack of accountability is what makes violence basically keep getting reproduced all the time over time. And of course, in this reproduction of violence and accountability, the most important thing, for example, when I looked at sort of violence against the Armenians through Ottoman and Turkish history, what marked each and every stage was the lack of accountability. And that is especially crucial with the last stage, where I look at Hrant Dink's assassination. And the fact that today, even though so much time has gone since 2007, 14 years, and there is still no culprit. They have the person who pulled the trigger. They do not have still brought in front of the law the person who actually gave the command. And we know those people are officials and officers within the Turkish state. And that makes it especially poignant because the violence keeps continuing. If the people who committed are not held accountable, then their first go-to when there's another problem is they try to solve everything through violence because it's worked for them and they haven't been held accountable. That's why we need to change and bring in the rule of law. But of course, that's not happening. And also, as I said, talking about minorities, that also is extremely important because it's the linchpin of democracy, as I said, and it also enables one to develop a bottom-up analysis in a society. And sociologically, the top-down analyses are usually the ones, the structural ones that have been the dominant hegemonic narratives. And recently, by focusing on the micro, the everyday, and the way they interact, people interact with each other, looking at meaning construction from the way up enables one to develop another, hopefully, standpoint. And that's what I'm trying to do with this new thing. And it also enables one to sort of bring in as I said, sort of critical sociology and inclusive sociology, because it is looking at things from the vantage point of minorities. So then this is predicated, as I said, on the denial of violence, the book I had before. And what is the major findings there? I sort of basically summarize around three concepts. And these are the three concepts that then I focus on in developing my contemporary and future work. It's the violence told from the vantage point of perpetrators as well as survivors. I think what we often do is that we focus exclusively on victims, or we focus exclusively on perpetrators, but we do not look at the two of them in interaction with each other. And I think especially in studying minorities, we can only understand what they are doing and what they are not doing, what they're resisting and what they're protesting, only if we also bring in the hegemonic majorities, perpetrators, norms, values, and practices. So that's why connectedness in terms of power inequities is important, connectedness in the ensuing, basically, interpretation. The second one is violence is layered, erased, redefined over time. And this is why historicity becomes important. In the case of the denial of the Armenian genocide in Turkey, I've shown, at least in the book, tried to show how over time through memoirs, you can see first they deny the act itself, then they deny sort of who the perpetrators are, and then they deny the entire sort of narrative. So it goes and it builds over time. And of course, the linchpin is, as you know, last week, finally, the United States acknowledged the genocide, and Turkey totally shut down, Turkish state at least, and went into protest, denial, full denial. In response, and we'll see how that basically develops over time. But I think it's going to make sort of the practice of acknowledgements much more widespread because of the United States' dominant position in the world order at the moment. And the third one is that violence is reproduced, suppressed through intersections, and intersectionality, as you know, with Kimberly Crenshaw and also with Patricia Hill Collins, especially in the United States with respect to race, the way it intersects with inequities is extremely important. And I think the same also holds for us in terms of ethnicity, in terms of, religiosity, maybe, if you think about the campaign against the Gülen movement with respect to ethnicity, the campaign against Kurds in general. I mean, so these all, I think, develop, as I said, out of this intersectionality. So what do I go from here? I extend the social actors domestically from Armenians to Kurds in Turkey. And I have already collected data. We've interviewed 60 Kurds in terms of the violence that they experienced in Turkey. And what I'm doing is I'm going beyond only physical violence, because what I realized with the Armenian genocide was, like, in a way, those who died were almost the lucky ones, because the ones who survived kept experiencing violence over and over again, because, of course, the violence hadn't been acknowledged against them in the first place. And almost it was bad in terms of what it did to them. That is why I brought in the mind, the mental, and spirit, the communal, to see, how we can look at violence as it impacts these two. And that's going to be my next empirical book. After I write this one, and this is the theory book that I was talking to you about, it extends social actors globally, from the Kurds in Turkey to Black people in the United States. by expanding the concept of minorities globally, because that is ultimately what I want to do. Can we go beyond the post-colonial and try to bring the global south, global north within one sort of very power inequity sensitive theory? That's what I'm working on. And I argue that the association of, I analyze the association of both Kurds and Blacks in terms of their association to power and ensuing violence in accordance with historicity, connectedness, and intersectionality. These are the three catchwords, as you know, of the last decade or so. What I'm trying to do is to theorize and conceptualize the three to develop a new perception from the vantage point of minorities. So, oops, okay. So what's the theoretical trajectory? What do I base it on? It's a global critical approach to collective violence against minorities in conversation with the domestic and global DuBoisian framework. I don't know how well you know Du Bois's work, double consciousness, but I think I see him as sort of the founder of an alternate American sociology, at least because he is able to, through the double consciousness, acknowledge that there are two standpoints, the standpoint of the minority, the Blacks, and as well as the standpoint of the majority as they are perceived by the Blacks. And that's where it emerges. It is in conversation with this new book, and I have all of the books that I am in conversation with, and all these people basically, and I can talk about them further if you want me to, but these are basically critical sociologists at the moment throughout the world, at least the ones I know and can read in English. So what are the underlying premises of the global critical approach? Well, the assumptions are radical. In a way, the aim is to change the socially constructed social system based on Western modernity, because as you know, Western modernity privileges Europe, European history, the development of modernity within Europe, and then because of its sort of assumptions of universality, then takes that model hook, line, and sinker and tries to apply it to all these non-Western societies where things don't work. And the way, of course, we perceive them in the non-West is we think, oh, we're failing, we're not doing something right. And we blame ourselves rather than the imposition of this theory on us. And that is sort of why it's radical, because it questions that formulation and comes up with an alternate one. It's conflict-oriented by overcoming the material, ideological, and virtual challenges, but it's not consensus-oriented, basically. Then if you take it, it sort of takes, starts from Marx onwards in the same notion of what later Habermas, focusing much more on power and power inequities, the way it impacts knowledge formation. And the third one, and this is of course what changes or is different with critical theories from other ones and post-colonial theory as well, is that it is emancipatory. It aims to achieve social justice, emancipation, just participation, not just participation, anyhow. So as a consequence of that, I developed this triangulation approach. One, it is from the standpoint of minorities as social actors, privileged in approaching violence in relation to the actions of majority, and narrative of interpreters. And this is what I argue in the case of Western modernity. What you have is, you don't only have the rulers and the ruled, or the perpetrators and victims or survivors. What you have in addition is the civil society, media, interpreters, expertise, scholars who sort of interpret everything that is going on within the civil sphere. So that is the triangulation that I'll be talking to you about. Challenges are articulated, I argue, through collective violence, and power of social actors is distributed, retained, reproduced, or lost in relation to historicity, connectedness, and intersectionality, which are the three things that I have talked about before. So if you think about the model, I'm looking at sort of the agency, the elements of power, and sort of violence, and showing violence. You see that I see violence as a sort of a process here. And if you look at the way I sort of triangulate things, these are sort of the majority actions here. And then these are the minority actions. This is what Marx and all conflict theories focus on. This is the new one I bring in, interpretive narratives or narration, discourse, and how significant that has become in terms of meaning in our society. So what happens is that these three, in a way, sustain themselves and reproduce inequity over time. They do so through intersectionality, connectedness, and historicity. Before I turn to these social actors in Turkey and the United States, which is my empirical part, do you have any questions at this point? Because I gave you a lot of theory. Americans here can't handle theory much. I know Turks are much better at it on sort of, these conceptual things. Do you have any questions, comments? Do you want to do so? Ask them now. Okay, just checking to make sure. Okay, so let's just go and look at then what I mean by these three social actors, three groups in Turkey and the United States. Of course, minorities are defined as non-Muslim minorities historically, especially Armenians, in terms of the violence that they have experienced, to the leading minority group, namely Kurds. Of course, Kurds do not consider themselves a minority group because they are a part of the foundation of the Turkish Republic, or they were until we reneged on our promises. But nevertheless, they are about 17 to 20% of the population in Turkey. And if you define minority in terms of who has access to resources considered valuable in a society at the expense of whom, if that's how you define it, obviously Kurds are there along with, Assyrians, Alevis, and other groups, Chaldeans, and others that are too many to mention. The majority, on the other hand, is sort of Sunni Muslim, urban, ethnic Turkish. That's at least Baskın Oran sort of has a name for all of them, which is very, really funny, but an acronym for it. Anyhow, but that's basically where I belong to. And interpreters, who are the interpreters? Ranging from mostly male educators, clergy, scientists and academics, public journalists, and artists. These are mostly professionals, and they're the ones who create meaning in civil society outside of the state. And you can imagine what's been happening since 2003 with that party in power. Is even though there was a period of opening in the beginning, especially after Erdogan becoming president, that pretty much shut down, and these interpreters that have been left in Turkey are only the ones that speak the same as the government and the political party in power rather than opponents. Opponents are either in jail, like the HDP representatives, or they are silenced, or they sort of are online and outside the sort of control and surveillance to a certain degree of the Turkish state. When you look at the United States in the same way, what are the social actors there? Of course, in terms of the sort of minorities, it started with indigenous people, especially Native Americans, I say, because there are also Mexicans down south, against which the United States expands to racialize Black people because of the way in which Blacks were brought in, of course, violently, initially as property, which sort of destroyed, I think, the way in which they could have been possibly equitably integrated into American society, which they weren't. But if you look at the majority, it's white American, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, WASP as we know it. But I think, as Du Bois said, the important there is white there, because the race divide, Du Bois said, is the most significant social divide in American society, and I agree with him. Interpreters in this case range from educators, scientists and academics, officers and officials, public intellectuals, journalists and artists. So these are also, so this is my triangulation within which I look at these actors, and how does the power of these social actors change? I say that we can look at the meanings that are created in terms of who has power at whose expense and what violence ensues as a consequence in terms of historicity, connectedness, and intersectionality, and remembering violence in difficult past. This historicity, connectedness is acknowledging the agency of violence, and intersectionality is assessing variations in violence. And then I basically go into each one. Historicity being my favorite, since I also started by doing Ottoman history, and that was a lot of fun, learning Ottoman and all that. And I also learned Kurdish too, Kurmanji Kurdish, because I learned it out of respect for the minority that I'm studying, so that they don't think I'm there to just exploit what they have without giving anything in return. So what is important there is the critical analysis of the accumulation, devolution of power over time within Western modernity between the hegemonic majority and minorities. So I look at sort of it with respect to how is this violence that's committed, sort of how does it change over time, and pretty much that's what I did in my Denial of Violence book. And what makes the past difficult? Publicly silences versus remembering collective violence embedded within a society that either destabilizes or reproduces contemporary power, leading the majority to instrumentalize violence over time. And this happens in both instances. And then the empirical analysis of historicity. Here I sort of put down everything. I had to make this, crystallize it into many little words, but I'm sure you can read this on your own later on in more detail. What's very important in both instances, I argue that when you look at both in terms of historicity, there is a time in the formation of both Turkish Republic and the United States of America where an initial foundational violence is committed. I argued that this was, of course, the genocide was one such foundational violence that led to the foundation. I mean, it was the foundational violence of the Turkish Republic that never became acknowledged. But what was very important in that violence was that in the book, I demonstrate that Armenians were and non-Muslim minorities were specifically left out of the independence movement. Only Turks or Muslims, including the Kurds, could participate in the movement. So that, by definition, left the Armenians out of the body politic. What I was interested in is, after the Armenians were decimated in Turkey, what happens then with the continuation and what happens with the Kurds, because then Kurds emerge as the major minority in Turkey, against whom these things develop. What is very important in that, the foundational violence, is that very similar to the way Armenians were left out, I realized that there is the pivotal movement of systemic foundational violence occurs between 1919 and 23. And This is when you look at basically to the events starting with the basically the Sivas Congress, October 1919, where they are talking about a Muslim majority. So Kurds and Turks are basically included. Whereas later, 20th of October 1919, with the Amasya Protocol, what happens is that it says the lands of the Ottoman state comprise the lands where Turks and Kurds live. Kurds are an inseparable element of Ottoman society, and this is an argument they make, and this gets codified in 1921 with the Teşkilat-ı Esasiye Kanunu, where Articles 12 and 14 say representatives are chosen by the local populace, and then it's exercised in 16th, 17th, 1923 Izmit meeting, which is a very, contentious meeting, but nevertheless, there it says, hence, whichever administrative division has a Kurdish populace, they will govern themselves independently. These are all the declarations of the Kemalist government at the time. And then the reneging occurs on the 1924 Constitution, Article 88, the populace of Turkey will be considered, without regard to religion or race, Turkish as citizens. Türk itlaf is the word. And the 1520 October 1927, when, of course, Atatürk comes up with the Nutuk, which is literally becomes the official history of the Turkish Republic, he censors discussions regarding the Kurds, only mentions the British attempts to establish sovereign Kurdistan and how they were destroyed. And then the full Izmit text where all this thing happened was not published until 1929-30 in the newspaper and in 1993 as a book. So this is what has been the problem. When you look at then what has been going on historically from the vantage point of the Kurds, you realize that there is a big injustice done, and it's no accident that violence against the Turkish state starts very early on, exactly from 1924-25, and is still with us today, because of this reneging that happened. And we have not talked about this in Turkish society at all. I mean, how basically the Turkish Republican leaders went back on their words when they were able to sign the Lausanne Treaty and establish the Turkish Republic. Turkish Republic, not Anatolian Republic, not some other republic, and that's important too. When you look at the United States in a similar way, what you see then is basically indigenous people are there, and then of course the white settlers come, and then they also reimagine their past and literally wipe out the indigenous people, and whites now consider those who were born in the United States, call themselves birthers, as if they are the true owners of this country. So they, these intentionally excluded indigenous peoples from the body politic by plundering their land, transforming it into private property. And also, of course, very significant in this process is they do the same with the blacks. It's even worse because blacks are considered private property, not even humans. And as a consequence, there is a lot of violence against them, almost a genocide, then. What's the pivotal moment? I argue that it's 1776 to 83, because that is when the systemic exclusion becomes codified. US Declaration of Rights and ensuing formulation of the US Constitution. When you say the we the people, the we there does not include blacks, and it does not include indigenous people either. And that is what's very important. That is, I think, the foundation of violence. And here I give you the US narrative of what happened in terms of the civilizational progress and manifest destiny. And I also give you the opposing Black narrative. How are things seen from their vantage point? And that is, of course, is important. They too, I argue, are left out of the body politic when the US was founded. And because of that, it's incredibly difficult to once more integrate them as we're trying to do here into society in the name of diversity. Then I go to connectedness, where you look at the articulation and reproduction of power, and how is the agency of violence produced, practiced, and reproduced. And there, as I said, I look at both the majority and the minority together. So if you look at Turkey and the Kurds from this vantage point, what does elimination of the Armenians do? It enables a sort of Turks to plunder the non-Muslim wealth and real estate. They equate exclusionary white settler nationalism, literally, which is what they're practicing, with patriotism. And then there are the pogroms, as you know, that follow. I mean, so you're telling the story of the minorities and majority in terms of the violences that happen between them throughout Turkish history. And then Kurds are asked by the Turkish military to either love or leave their ancestral lands. As you know, Yasser Yatakit, when I saw that in the Arbor and in these other places, I said, who wrote them? I said, it's not the Turkish military who has to write these. It should be the Kurds who should say, hey, either love our ancestral lands, you Turks, or leave them. I mean, you know, anyhow, what is important here is sort of also the emergence of vigilante justice and paramilitary groups, unfortunately, very similar to Teşkilat-ı Mahsusa, to keep the Kurds under surveillance since, and the Kurds are assassinated and obviously destroyed because, as I said, the initial violence was either not recognized or falsely attributed to Kurds. I mean, you know, we blame the Kurds for the violence during the Turkish Republic and the official Turkish historiography, but we do not realize that's because we reneged. The Turkish state reneged on a promise to the Kurds to include them in the body politic and never did. Literally, that's why they're angry. Not because they're angry people or they are violent people, because they act that way because of the violence that was done to them. If you look at the United States and the Blacks there, I mean, there too, you see from the beginning, you know, how basically Blacks and white settlers start basically confronting Native Americans, and white settlers keep confronting each other, and Blacks, of course, start facing violence because initially they're property, and then they then become the racialized other. And what happens to the Native Americans is that they're sort of given custody and almost marginalized. And then when you look at the Blacks, of course, they initially, because their property, their custody is given to white landowners. And then after the 1863 abolition of slavery, it's sort of assumed that they would then become included. But as you know, to this day, unfortunately, the violence against Blacks continue, because I would argue that this violence throughout American history that was acknowledged sort of made violence an instrument of the American state as well in dealing with minorities who haven't been included to the body politic. Then intersectionality, Of course, it looks at sort of class, gender, sexuality, age, ability, and the way they intersect with race is the most important way. We can see this working out in the United States, and Du Bois' work is very important, and I can talk about him later if you wanted me to. But the problem, of course, is that intersectionality deals with a lot of variations that are hard because privileges, basically intersectionality privileges the present. It sort of falls shorter when you look at the past or the future. And as a consequence, you know, how can you look at intersectionality critically is what I try to do at least. And when you look at that in relation to the Turkey and the Kurds, I look at it, you know, how Kurds become marginalized, how are they defined in relation to Turks in a sort of denigrative way, how there's this mountain Turks, all these meanings created around Kurds and lack of meanings because they're systematically, Kurdish language, culture, art, and architecture is sort of constantly destroyed. Rural villages, as you know, were decimated to prevent so-called terrorism. Religion is also involved in justifying violence, and Justice and Development Party privileges this religious intersectionality with the intent to recruit Kurds into their party. They also instrumentalize it. They are not interested in, they never were interested in, I don't think, bringing Kurds into the Turkish body politic. What they did instead was to basically look at the ones who put their religion before the ethnic identity and have them recruited into the AK Party, but when they realized there weren't too many of these, they basically once more excluded and marginalized the Kurds, because the intent is not democracy. The intent is, of course, to exclude. If you look at how the Blacks have been treated, you know, there are variations across regions, initial points of origin, colorism, and all these are sort of looked at, and it makes it sort of complex. And what is, of course, silenced are the experiences of Black Americans and their expressions through African languages, culture, and arts, which are all silenced. And then, of course, there are the intersections with gender and sexuality I won't go into, but in this context, the GI Bill, for example, and is very important because that is when the American government basically gave all the veterans coming back from the Second World higher education. And that was, people argued, how the middle class was created in American society. And what's very interesting is they only let white soldiers into it. Women who were there and Blacks were not included. And that in itself then demonstrates how these intersections of race and citizenship and race and other, you know, military service lead to these exclusions and marginalizations themselves. And such discrimination and the multi-layered version is why I think we can still not get rid of it, but are trying very hard. So that is the end of my show. Thank you very much for listening. I know this is a lot, but hey, when you have COVID, you just sit and think all the time and get into trouble. So I am done with my presentation and look very much forward to your questions. Thank you.